The farmer's plow struck something solid beneath the Iowa soil, and when he dug it out, he found a glass bottle sealed with wax. Inside was a handwritten message with his grandfather's name on it, dated 3 days before the old man disappeared in 1952. What the farmer did next would uncover a secret that powerful men had buried for 70 years. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning began like countless others on the Hartwell farm, a sprawling tract of rich black earth in eastern Iowa, where corn grew tall and the horizon stretched unbroken in every direction. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of rain that had not yet fallen. A cool autumn wind swept across the fields, bending the dried stalks that remained after harvest, their brittle leaves whispering secrets to one another in the fading light of October. The air carried the sharp scent of turned earth and decaying vegetation, the smell of a season dying and making way for winter's sleep. For Thomas Hartwell, this land was more than soil and seed. It was legacy, written in generations of sweat and stubbornness. His grandfather had broken this ground with a horse-drawn plow in the 1940s, built the white farmhouse that still stood at the edge of the property, and raised a family here when the world was simpler and men kept their word with a handshake. Thomas had inherited the farm when his father passed 5 years ago, and with it came the weight of memory, the stories passed down about Grandfather Edwin, a man Thomas had never met, a man who had vanished without a trace in the winter of 1952. The disappearance had become family legend, whispered about at holiday gatherings, and never fully explained. Edwin had been a respected man in Millbrook County, a veteran of the war who'd come home to farm and raise his son. Then, one December morning, he'd left the house before dawn and never returned. His truck was found abandoned on a back road near the old Brennan property, keys still in the ignition, no sign of struggle. The sheriff at the time had ruled it an accident, suggested Edwin might have fallen through ice on the creek or wandered off in confusion. But Thomas's grandmother had never believed it. Until her death, she'd insisted that something terrible had happened, that someone had taken Edwin from them. Thomas was a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered from years of labor, with calloused hands that bore the permanent stains of engine grease and field dirt. His face was weathered, lined from squinting into too many sunrises, and his dark hair had begun to gray at the temples. He lived alone now in the old farmhouse, his wife Sarah having left 3 years ago for a life less isolated, less demanding. She'd wanted children, community, a life that extended beyond the boundaries of 600 acres. Thomas had wanted the land. In the end, the land had won, but the victory felt hollow on cold nights when the house creaked with emptiness. His only companion was a border collie named Jasper, a sharp-eyed dog with black and white markings who trotted faithfully beside the tractor as Thomas worked the fields. Jasper had been a gift from Sarah before she left, perhaps her way of ensuring Thomas wouldn't be completely alone. The dog had proven himself invaluable, not just for herding the small cattle herd Thomas kept, but for the companionship that made the silence bearable. This particular morning, Thomas was preparing the north field for winter plowing, turning over the soil to let it breathe and break down the stubble before the first snow came. It was methodical work, the kind that allowed the mind to wander while the hands stayed busy. The tractor, an old red Massey Ferguson that had belonged to his father, rumbled steadily across the earth, the plow blade cutting deep furrows in its wake. The soil here was some of the richest in the county, dark as coal and thick with nutrients built up over centuries. Jasper ran alongside the tractor, occasionally darting after a field mouse or pausing to sniff at something interesting in the dirt. The dog's energy was boundless, his joy in the simple act of running a reminder that not everything required complexity to be worthwhile. Thomas had been working for perhaps 2 hours when it happened. The plow struck something. The jolt was sudden and violent, the kind that rattled Thomas's teeth and made the tractor lurch sideways with a metallic shriek. The steering wheel jerked in his hands, and for a moment he thought he'd hit a buried boulder or an old piece of farm equipment left to rust beneath the soil. He killed the engine immediately, heart pounding, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the whistle of wind across the open field. Rocks were common enough, especially in the north field where glaciers had deposited debris thousands of years ago. But this felt different. The sound had been metallic, solid, deliberate. Not the dull thud of stone against steel, but something sharper, more resonant. He climbed down from the cab, boots sinking into the freshly turned soil, and walked back to where the plow had caught. The furrow was torn and uneven, dirt heaped in irregular mounds. Jasper was already there, pawing frantically at the earth, his tail rigid with excitement, a high whine building in his throat. "Easy, boy," Thomas said, kneeling beside him. "What did we find?" He began brushing away clumps of black earth with his hands, his fingers quickly becoming caked with mud. At first, he saw only more soil and the occasional stone. But then his fingers touched something smooth, cold, unmistakably glass. His breath caught. He dug faster now, pulling away handfuls of dirt, his heart beginning to race with a strange mixture of excitement and unease. Within minutes, he had unearthed it. A thick glass bottle, the kind used for preserving in the old days, with heavy walls and a wide mouth. It was sealed at the top with dark red wax that had somehow survived decades underground, protected by the very soil that had hidden it. The glass was clouded with age and dirt, but through it, Thomas could see something inside. Paper, rolled tightly and yellowed with time. His hands trembled as he lifted the bottle from the earth. It was heavier than he expected, substantial and real in a way that made his chest tighten with anticipation. The bottle was perhaps 10 inches tall, its surface etched with minor scratches and pits from years of contact with stones and roots. But it was intact, unbroken, as if someone had placed it here with great care. Jasper whined softly, pressing against his leg as if sensing the weight of the moment, the shift in the air that suggested they had stumbled into something significant. Thomas turned the bottle slowly in his hands, examining it from every angle. The wax seal was intact, unbroken, pressed down over what appeared to be a cork stopper. Someone had buried this deliberately, carefully, intending for it to stay hidden. But why? And why here, in the middle of his field, in soil that hadn't been deeply plowed in decades? He stood slowly, clutching the bottle to his chest, and glanced around the empty expanse of farmland. The wind had picked up, colder now, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain and something else, something indefinable that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle with primitive warning. The field stretched out in every direction, silent and still save for the rustling of dried corn stalks in the neighboring plot. Yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen eyes tracked his every movement from the tree line that bordered the western edge of his property. He shook off the feeling. Too many years alone, too many nights listening to the house settle and imagining footsteps, and carried the bottle back toward the farmhouse. Jasper trotted nervously at his heels, his usual playful energy replaced by a tense wariness. The dog kept looking back over his shoulder, ears swiveling to catch sounds Thomas couldn't hear. The farmhouse stood a quarter-mile from where Thomas had been working, a white two-story structure with a wraparound porch and green shutters that needed painting. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, but Thomas had let the fire die that morning, too focused on field work to tend to domestic comfort. Now, approaching it with the bottle in his hands, the house looked almost forlorn, a remnant of better days when it had been filled with family and warmth. Inside, the kitchen was dim and cool, filled with the smell of coffee left too long on the burner and the faint mustiness of a house that needed a woman's touch. Thomas set the bottle on the scarred wooden table, the same table where his grandfather had once eaten breakfast, where Thomas had done homework as a boy, and stared at it for a long moment, suddenly afraid to break the seal, afraid of what he might find. The rational part of his mind suggested it was probably nothing. Maybe an old-time capsule buried by schoolchildren decades ago, or a farmer's record of crop yields preserved for posterity. But something deeper, something that felt like ancestral memory, whispered that this was significant, that he had been meant to find it. Jasper sat at his feet, watching the bottle with the same intensity Thomas felt, as if the dog too understood that this was no ordinary discovery. Finally, curiosity, and something deeper, something that felt like destiny pulling him forward, drove Thomas to action. He took a kitchen knife from the drawer, an old paring knife with a wooden handle worn smooth by generations of use, and carefully began chipping away at the wax seal. It crumbled in dark red flakes, scattering across the table like dried blood, releasing a faint smell of old paraffin and something herbal, perhaps rosemary or sage used in the sealing process. When the seal was broken, he pried out the cork stopper with a soft pop that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. He tilted the bottle and coaxed the rolled paper out. It slid free with a dry whisper, brittle and fragile in his hands, threatening to crumble at the slightest pressure. Thomas carried it to the window where the gray morning light was strongest. He unrolled it slowly, infinitely carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he could feel his pulse in his temples. The paper was old, the edges browned and cracked like autumn leaves, but the writing was still legible, neat, careful script in fading black ink that had somehow resisted the decay of 7 decades. And at the top, in bold letters that made Thomas's blood run cold and his hands freeze mid-motion, was a name. Edwin Hartwell. His grandfather's name. Thomas's breath stopped. His vision tunneled. For a moment, he thought he might pass out. The shock of seeing that name, that impossible, unexpected name, hitting him like a physical blow. His hands shook so badly the paper rattled, and he had to set it on the windowsill to steady himself. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But the paper was real. The ink was real. And his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, which Thomas had seen in old letters and journals his grandmother had kept, was unmistakably real. With trembling hands, Thomas read the message beneath the name. October 14th, 1952. To whoever finds this. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it out. They've been watching me for 3 weeks now, ever since I saw what I wasn't supposed to see. Black cars that idle at the end of the road. Men in suits who ask questions in town about my habits, my family, where I go. I know they won't let me leave Millbrook alive. I've seen too much. I know what they're doing on the old Brennan property, what they're burying in the northeast corner, who they're protecting, how deep the corruption runs. I tried to go to Sheriff Dalton, but he's one of them. Laughed in my face and told me to stop making up stories. Said if I kept talking, I'd find myself in trouble I couldn't get out of. I went to the county seat, tried to see the state police, but they turned me away. Said local matters stay local. There's no one left to trust. They've got everyone bought or scared. I'm leaving this here, in the north field where I plowed my first furrow when I came home from the war, hoping someday someone will dig deep enough to find the truth. Someone braver than me. Someone who won't be scared off. The proof is buried near the old oak at the edge of Brennan's land, 20 paces due west from the trunk. Look for the stone marked with 3 crosses carved in the shape of a triangle. Under that stone is a metal box. Inside you'll find photographs, documents, names, everything needed to bring them down. But be careful. These aren't ordinary men. They have money, power, connections that reach into every corner of this county and beyond. They've killed before, and they'll kill again. Don't trust the men in town. Don't trust anyone who says they're here to help. Trust only what you can verify with your own eyes. If my family ever reads this, tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I tried to do the right thing. Tell my son Benjamin that his father wasn't a coward who ran away, but a man who stood up when it mattered. Tell my wife Martha that I loved her until my last breath. To whoever finds this and has the courage to finish what I started, God be with you. You'll need him. Edwin Hartwell. Thomas read the message 3 times, each pass making his stomach twist tighter, his chest constrict with a mixture of grief, rage, and growing fear. His grandfather hadn't just disappeared. He'd been murdered, silenced because he'd discovered something so dangerous that powerful people had decided he couldn't be allowed to live. And whatever Edwin had discovered was still buried out there, waiting. The date at the top of the letter burned in his mind. October 14th, 1952. 3 days before Edwin Hartwell vanished. 3 days before he'd said goodbye to his wife and son on what would be his last morning, climbed into his truck, and driven toward whatever fate awaited him. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes, not just for the grandfather he'd never known, but for his grandmother who'd died never knowing the truth, and for his father who'd grown up believing his dad had abandoned them. He set the letter down with shaking hands and stared out the kitchen window at the fields beyond, seeing them now through different eyes. The Brennan property bordered his land to the west, an abandoned stretch of overgrown pasture and scrub forest that hadn't been farmed in decades, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Everyone in town said Old Man Brennan had sold it to some corporation in the 50s and moved away with the money. The land had sat empty ever since, posted with no trespassing signs that nobody paid much attention to. Hunters occasionally crossed it during deer season. Teenagers sometimes used it for parties. But mostly, it was forgotten, a blank spot on the map that nobody thought about. Until now, Thomas's mind raced. What had his grandfather seen? What was buried on that property that was worth killing for? And more importantly, were the same people, or their descendants, still protecting it? Jasper barked suddenly, sharp and insistent, his body going rigid as he stared at the front door. The sound shattered Thomas's thoughts and sent adrenaline surging through his system. Thomas froze, every sense suddenly alert. He listened, straining to hear past the hammer of his own heartbeat. At first, there was nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, the crunch of gravel on the long driveway leading to the house, the low rumble of a powerful engine approaching slowly, deliberately. Someone was coming. Thomas moved quickly to the window and peered through the curtain, careful to stay hidden. A black SUV was rolling slowly up the drive, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. It was an expensive vehicle, new and gleaming despite the dust of country roads, completely out of place in this rural setting where pickup trucks and farm equipment were the norm. His pulse quickened. He didn't recognize the vehicle, and out here, strangers didn't just drop by. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and anyone Thomas knew would have called first, would have driven something he'd recognize. Moving fast but staying calm, Thomas folded the letter carefully and shoved it deep into his jacket pocket. He grabbed the bottle and tucked it into a cabinet beneath the sink, pushing it behind old cleaning supplies where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Jasper growled low in his throat, hackles raised along his spine, his instincts screaming warnings that Thomas felt in his own gut. The SUV stopped in front of the house, engine idling for a long moment before shutting off. 2 men climbed out, both wearing dark suits and ties, completely inappropriate for rural Iowa in October. One was tall and lean with silver hair and the kind of face that belonged in boardrooms, not farmyards. The other was shorter and broader, with a thick neck and the watchful eyes of someone trained in violence. They moved with the careful precision of people accustomed to being obeyed, their shoes crunching deliberately on the gravel as they approached. Thomas took a deep breath, steadied himself, and opened the door before they could knock. He stepped onto the porch with Jasper at his side, the dog's growl now a steady rumble. "Can I help you?" The tall man smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes were cold, calculating, measuring Thomas like a problem to be solved. "Mr. Hartwell?" "Thomas Hartwell." "That's right." Thomas kept his voice neutral, his stance relaxed but ready. "My name is David Kern. This is my associate, Mr. Lowe. We're with Meridian Land Development Corporation." He pulled a business card from his pocket with practiced ease and held it out, the gesture smooth and rehearsed. Thomas didn't take it. "I'm not selling." Kern's smile tightened slightly, the first crack in his professional veneer. "We haven't made an offer yet, Mr. Hartwell. We're in the area evaluating properties for potential acquisition. Your land has significant value for a project we're developing in the region." "Not interested." Thomas crossed his arms, making his position clear. Lowe, the shorter man, stepped forward. His voice was flat and emotionless, devoid of Kern's false friendliness. "Mr. Hartwell, we're not here to pressure you, but it would be in your best interest to hear us out. There are complications with this property that you may not be aware of. Complications that could become problematic." Thomas felt his jaw clench, anger rising in his chest. "What kind of complications?" "Historical liens dating back to the 1950s. Environmental concerns from previous agricultural practices. Legal issues regarding property boundaries and mineral rights." Kern's eyes flickered toward the fields, lingering on the north plot where Thomas had been working. "It would be easier for everyone if you simply accepted our offer and moved on. We're prepared to be very generous, well above market value." The threat was barely veiled, hanging in the air between them like smoke. Thomas felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady, controlled. "I said I'm not interested. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. It's not for sale at any price. Now get off my property." For a long moment, the 2 men stood motionless, their expressions unreadable. Kern's smile had vanished completely, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. Lowe's hand had moved slightly, resting near the opening of his suit jacket in a gesture Thomas recognized from his brief time in the army. the instinctive reach toward a concealed weapon. Then Kern nodded slowly, deliberately. "We understand, Mr. Hartwell. You're an emotional attachment to the land. Family legacy. We respect that." He tucked the business card back into his pocket. "But think carefully about what we've said. Sometimes holding on to the past can be dangerous. Accidents happen on farms. Equipment fails. People get hurt." The words sent ice down Thomas's spine, but he held his ground. "That sounds like a threat." "Not at all." Kern's smile returned, colder than before. "Just a statement of fact. Farming is dangerous work. We'd hate to see anything happen to you." He gestured to Lo, and the two men turned and walked back to the SUV, moving with the same careful deliberation they'd arrived with. Thomas watched them drive away, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. Jasper continued growling until the vehicle disappeared down the long driveway, dust hanging in the air behind it like a warning. They knew. Somehow, impossibly, they knew he'd found something. Thomas went back inside and pulled the letter from his pocket, reading it again with new understanding. "They've been watching me for 3 weeks now. Black cars that idle at the end of the road. Men in suits who ask questions in town." History was repeating itself 70 years later. He looked at Jasper, who sat watching him with intelligent, worried eyes. "Looks like we've got ourselves a problem, boy." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with sudden violence. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. And somewhere in the distance, Thomas thought he heard the faint rumble of an engine, not leaving, but circling, staying close, watching and waiting. The message had been meant for him. His grandfather had buried it knowing that someday, someone from his bloodline would find it. And now, whether he wanted it or not, Thomas Hartwell was about to uncover a secret that had been buried for 70 years. A secret that someone was still willing to kill to protect. The north field stretched out beyond his window, dark soil turned and waiting. And somewhere out there, on the old Brennan property, the truth lay buried beneath a stone marked with 3 crosses. Thomas folded the letter carefully and looked at the clock. He had decisions to make, and not much time to make them. The storm was coming, in more ways than one. Thomas waited until nightfall before making his move. The storm his grandfather had predicted, both literal and metaphorical, had finally arrived, bringing sheets of cold rain that hammered against the farmhouse windows and turned the fields into rivers of mud. It was the perfect cover. No one would expect him to venture out in this weather, which meant no one would be watching as carefully. He dressed in dark clothing, pulled on his heaviest work boots, and grabbed a flashlight and the old army-issue shovel from the shed. Jasper whined at the door, sensing the danger but unwilling to be left behind. Thomas knelt and gripped the dog's face gently. "You stay here, boy. Guard the house." Jasper's ears drooped, but he obeyed, settling reluctantly by the fire. The walk to the Brennan property took 20 minutes through driving rain that soaked Thomas to the bone within minutes. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted trees and overgrown paths that hadn't seen human traffic in decades. The old oak his grandfather had mentioned stood like a sentinel at the property's edge, its massive trunk scarred by lightning and time. Thomas counted 20 paces due west, his boots sinking into mud with each step. He swept the flashlight across the ground until he found it. A flat stone half buried in soil and dead leaves, marked with 3 crosses arranged in a triangle, exactly as the letter had described. His hands shook as he began to dig. The metal box was buried 2 feet down, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept it dry. Thomas pried it open with the edge of his shovel, his breath catching as he saw what lay inside. Photographs of men in suits standing beside unmarked trucks, documents bearing government seals, and a ledger filled with names, dates, and amounts of money. But most damning were the photographs of barrels being buried, barrels stenciled with symbols Thomas recognized as chemical waste warnings. His grandfather had discovered an illegal dumping operation. Corporations had paid officials to look the other way while they buried toxic waste on the Brennan property, poisoning the groundwater and endangering every farm in the county. And they'd killed Edwin Hartwell to keep it secret. A branch snapped behind him. Thomas spun, flashlight beam catching 3 figures emerging from the trees. David Kern stood in the center, flanked by Lo and another man. All 3 held guns. "We were hoping you'd be smart and walk away," Kern said, rain streaming down his face. Your grandfather wasn't smart either. Thomas's mind raced. He thought of his grandmother who'd died without answers, his father who'd grown up fatherless, all because of greed and corruption. He thought of the poisoned land, the families who'd gotten sick, the truth that had been buried for 70 years. It's over, Thomas said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. I uploaded copies of everything to 3 different lawyers before I came here. Instructions to release it all if I don't check in by morning. It was a bluff. He hadn't had time, but Kern's face paled. In that moment of hesitation, Thomas dove sideways as gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through the space where he'd been standing. He ran, crashing through undergrowth, the metal box clutched against his chest. Behind him, shouts and more gunfire. He could hear Jasper barking frantically in the distance, and then sirens. Blue and red lights flashing through the trees. Thomas had made one call before leaving the house, not to the local sheriff, but to the state police, anonymously reporting gunshots on the Brennan property. It was enough. Officers swarmed the area, catching Kern and his men as they tried to flee. Thomas emerged from the trees, muddy and bleeding from scratches, but alive. He handed the box to a young state trooper and told him everything. 3 months later, the story made national news. Meridian Land Development was a shell company for corporations that had been illegally dumping waste for decades. Kern and 17 others were arrested, including the current county sheriff, the son of the sheriff who'd turned Edwin Hartwell away in 1952. Thomas stood in the north field, watching crews excavate the Brennan property, removing barrels of toxic waste that had been poisoning the land for 70 years. The EPA estimated cleanup would take years, but at least it was happening. He pulled his grandfather's letter from his pocket, reading it one final time. Edwin Hartwell had been right. They were dangerous, powerful, and connected. But he'd also been right about something else. Someone braver would eventually finish what he started. Thomas reburied the glass bottle in the exact spot where he'd found it, but this time with a new letter inside, telling his grandfather's story, honoring his courage, and explaining how the truth had finally been revealed. As he patted down the soil, Jasper barked once, sharp and clear, as if in approval. The storm had passed. The truth had emerged. And Edwin Hartwell could finally rest. Sometimes, Thomas thought as he walked back toward the farmhouse, the dead speak to us through the very ground we walk on. We just have to be willing to listen, and to dig deep enough to find what they've left behind.